Good morning, Internet. Um, count circuitries. So, a Geiger counter is a very sophisticated counting circuit. The tube and the power supply to the tube and the detector that sits in that power supply sample as fast as they can on the tube looking for a count. The design actually, the physics of the tubes requires a quench. So you have to let the tube get charged up by whatever you're measuring, and then you quench it back to zero. And then you let it count up, and you quench it back to zero. So very fast, very quickly, you are scanning the tube, getting counts off of the tube. For a Geiger counter, all you're saying is yes, there was a signal there, or no, there wasn't a signal. We don't look at the amplitude on a Geiger counter. So all it's doing is counting. They're very fast counters, and if in between their counts there's a 1 in there, it puts it up on the screen for you and does some math, makes it into 1 minute average, or displays it as a dose using a conversion factor, or any other number of measurements it can be converted to. So that detector tube is sitting there just turning on and off, basically. It's on all the time, but because of that little quench time and some very complicated math, we know how fast the detector electronics can sample, and from there we know if we see a count, it's a valid count from the detector. And that's all we're doing, is just counting pulses on that detector for any type of counts per minute, per second. All these instruments are pretty well built that way. They're doing time-sliced analysis, time-sliced sampling. So that quench time is an off time. So technically that tube is not counting for whatever the sum of the quench time is per minute. So there's actually time when the detector can't work. It can't see anything. And that's accounted for in a lot of ways. So too long a video to go into. So that is analog, or basically turning a signal into a count and counting it. The detector physics, what it can see, the power supply electronics, how fast it can sample to see, all combine into how we know how good the instrument is. Why we can say a Geiger counter, almost any Geiger counter, has a 30% accuracy. Now, that's a pretty big range and another long video. So the next detector type up you'd hear about in this is scintillation detectors, where you have a very sensitive detector. It could be a tube. Nowadays it could be a CCD type, camera type detector. And again, the speed of the detector's ability to sample whatever. So in the case of a scintillation detector, you've got a crystal. The crystal basically rings when an energy particle hits it. It creates light. The light hits that tube, and the tube measures how much light came off of the salt crystals inside that detector. So these circuits are different. They can be much faster, depending on all of the tube physics, the detector physics, right? How fast we can sample. And we've added a second level of information because we can get an amplitude off of that sample. And from that amplitude, we can make some assumptions about the energy, which allows us to make some assumptions about the particle. What particle touched the detector? So instead of doing counting, we're still counting because we're sampling in a time base because of the detector circuits, but now we can see amplitude because of the sensitivity of the detector types. So with an amplitude, we can do an identification of an element or an isotope, whereas with a count, we just knew we had an element or an isotope. So this is a real huge difference between a counting type detector and a scintillation type detector. The scintillation detector is still counting. It has all the numbers to do the count physics. But because it's so sensitive, a scintillation detector tuned might read 10,000 counts per second, not per minute, per second. This is the difference in the time, the speed of sampling on the detectors, and all the physics involved in getting the light there. So remember that particle hit a crystal inside a scintillation detector, and the crystal rang. The electrons in specific places got excited, sent off a photon of energy, and the tube is reading that photon, and it's actually summing up how many photons from that strike the detector detected. Now, I hope that all makes sense. Easy stuff. And we're 2 minutes past my 5-minute good morning. But good morning.